Brothers Hensman gives us The Prey, Legend of the Karnoctus. And this one has a cast of recognisable B-movie actors, including Nick Chinlund and Danny Trejo, who you may know both starred in the movie Con Air. You've also got Kevin Graveau, who you may know as the guy with a really deep voice from the Underworld movies, and a small role for Adrian Paul, best known in his role as the Highlander in the TV series. Now, the intention of this movie is to clearly marry the kind of the concepts of Predator and The Descent, and have this kind of hybrid action, horror, science fiction movie on a low budget, of course. Now, what is the story? It focuses on essentially two groups of people. We have a kind of squad of US soldiers who are on kind of routine patrol in this Afghanistan town, and they end up kind of getting shot up and have to kind of retreat into this cave, which then has a cave in because of an explosion. And then they meet some smugglers who are doing their own kind of nefarious things. And these two groups have to kind of work together to try and find an escape route out through these tunnels. However, things get complicated when they find out they're not alone and there is some type of creature living within these caves. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let us discuss what I think works in this movie. So this is a lower budget movie, so we have to have certain expectations whilst watching films like this. But you can certainly see the influence of primarily Predator, but the kind of the setting of the setting within these kind of caves. But I will say there are some things here that quite impress me. We have this opening sequence, very much like Predator, when we have a more of a kind of a military kind of style battle. And I was quite impressed with the kind of the location shooting in this sequence, where, you know, the movie takes place in Afghanistan, and they've kind of found a pretty good kind of stand-in for this kind of like small Afghan town that looks fairly authentic, I have to say. And in addition to that, you have a variety of kind of military vehicles. All the kind of the soldiers are kind of quite kind of like, you know, they're wearing realistic kind of like uniforms and things like that, with kind of guns and stuff. So I have to say, I think the production value looks reasonable here, and it's kind of like, it's fairly kind of well sort of set up in locations and props and things like that. And then we have these kind of cave sequences, and quite often when you have certainly low budget movies that takes place in caves, you have these kind of, you know, these cardboard walls of kind of cloth and stuff to kind of like fake having these kind of internal cave shots. And there's a little bit of that, but for a lot of those shots, it actually genuinely looks like we're shooting in kind of real, you know, stony caves, which kind of adds a kind of level of, you know, better production value within this. Another thing I really enjoyed, and this is primarily with the kind of the soldier characters, is we have this kind of incidental dialogue, and I've got to say, I think there's some influence by Tarantino here, because you can just tell the way that these guys are kind of like bantering to each other. It's clearly kind of a Tarantino style kind of dialogue. We have soldiers arguing who'd win in a fight between, you know, Yoda and Snake Eyes from G.I. Joe, for example. Then we have kind of like, you know, ribbing with the kind of the soldiers, even down to kind of like they're taking the kind of like the swipes at each other's ethnicity in a kind of a, you know, playful and loving way, to be honest. But I actually kind of quite like the kind of the dialogue between our kind of soldier characters, outside of one character who's very cartoonish, but the majority of them, I think, all seemed pretty kind of genuine to me. And I actually thought the acting from the kind of the actual unknown actors who play these kind of military soldiers was actually fairly good, with one exception. The creature itself, again, it's very influenced by Predator. You know, it's got glowing blood, it's kind of hunting them one by one, and it kind of sees in a kind of a weird vision. Not heat vision, that would be too similar. This time the creature kind of looks, he sees in kind of some type of X-ray vision, but it kind of has a similar kind of effect to Predator. The design of the creature is interesting, because it kind of reminds me of this 80s toy that I remember, that I can't remember the name of it, but it's got this purple monster toy that I remember seeing in the 80s. But outside of that, I guess it's between a kind of like an ape and a kind of spider in a way. It's kind of a quite interesting looking creature. Certainly, you know, quite unique looking in some ways, albeit I can't see this creature particularly kind of living in caves, if I'm completely honest. I don't know why it would be this kind of hairy, but there you go. But I quite like the creature designs for a kind of a low budget movie, because it is obviously a low budget movie and it is ultimately just a kind of a man in a suit. We do get a couple of kind of gory scenes. There's a lot of things here that are mixed, which I'm going to come on to, but there are a couple of sequences that we do see that are fairly gory. We see a character's head getting kind of like literally pancaked. We see a guy getting kind of torn into, and his torso is, you know, over here, and all the kind of guts are hanging out, things like that. But there are sequences where the movie does cut away as well. So there's a kind of again, a little bit of a mixed bag in terms of gore, and also kind of the special effects and things kind of like that. You know, it's a fairly predictable storyline, but at the same time it makes it kind of quite dependable. You kind of do know what you're kind of getting into, and it has some of those kind of scenes from Predator almost somewhat kind of remixed. You know, we won't have flares this time, we'll have glow sticks, and we'll kind of have the kind of the shouting like you do in Arnie did in Predator and things like that. So there's kind of like imitations, or let's call it loving homages to Predator in this movie. And obviously we have the new Predator movie coming out at some point this year, although this is clearly influenced by the original Predator. It's nice to see a couple of recognisable faces in here. Danny Trejo and Adrian Paul are practically just cameos, to be honest with you, and I have to be honest with you, are somewhat pointless, if I'm completely honest. I mean, Danny Trejo seems to be in like every B movie nowadays for like, you know, a couple of minutes apiece. I kind of quite like Adrian Paul's character, but again, they don't have a hell of a lot to do, if I'm completely honest with you there. But yeah, it is in regards to kind of like story, it's predictable and it's obvious, but it's, as I say, dependable kind of like time waster if you're a fan of kind of creature features and monster flicks and things like that. What doesn't work for me, okay, this is where the movie gets a little interesting for me, because there's a certain duality in this film, because as I say, we have these sort of two groups of people. We have our kind of cast of soldiers, who I think, with the exception of one person, are all kind of fairly well acted and kind of somewhat kind of realistic. Even the action sequences at the beginning of the movie, where we have this kind of like this military style action sequence that involves the soldiers, is shot fairly well. You know, it looks relatively kind of realistic. The gunfire, although they're obviously using CGI, looks okay. But then we have our mercenary smugglers, and it's the opposite. The sequences with that, it almost feels like sort of a different sequence, because we have a kind of a shootout sequence with those as well. And it looks horribly cheap. I mean, we have this really obvious kind of CGI kind of muzzle flashes, CGI kind of blood. And I've got to be honest with you, the actors that are playing it, who are all the recognisable actors, all the kind of the named actors here, felt like cartoon characters to me. I mean, they kind of, Nick Chinlund and I think Kevin Graveau, as they kind of go through the movie, get a little better. But it's just cheesy hammy. I mean, it's kind of, I think it's trying to vibe on that Expendables kind of style kind of movie in some ways, with these kind of more recognisable faces. But they're so in contrast to the soldiers, who I think were played relatively straight and played quite well. These guys seem a bunch of caricatures. So it's kind of, even the way the movie, that kind of part of the movie is shot, as I say, with kind of poorer CGI, poorer action sequence, it feels like two different films that have just been kind of like combined into one to make this hybrid film, where they kind of end up kind of teaming up. Once we kind of get into the cave, I think it kind of settles down, but those sort of sequences at the beginning, there's a stark contrast between it. I mean, even when we were in the cave, it's just like Nick Chinlund's character, who's an actor I quite like. You know, he's one of those sort of like, I remember him in one of the X-Files episodes as quite a standout episode. He's been in a few, he always plays bad guys normally. You know, he's playing this kind of super kind of macho, you know, military type. Obviously our kind of Arnie kind of stand-in, but it's just a little cheesy, if I'm completely. It's just a little bit silly at times, a little bit overcooked. Whilst, again, with the exception of one of the soldiers, all our kind of like military personnel just seem a little bit more grounded and a little bit kind of more realistic. I would have preferred, to be honest with you, for me personally, to have a little bit more of that, a little bit more, rather than a kind of a cheesy kind of silly macho-ness. And I've got a feeling it's because we've had the recognisable actors, they want to have like quotable lines and a bit of kind of comedy and things like this. And it just, to me, it kind of cheapens the movie and makes it seem more of a B-movie rather than more of a kind of a serious kind of action film. So let's just kind of move on now to the kind of the sequence in the middle, which is a kind of our slow sequence. Because the second act, I think, is a little bit dull. It's just our group now traversing through the kind of the caves, and not a lot happens, if we're being completely honest. They actually introduce a plot point, which I don't think they do enough with, where our group of survivors come across a Taliban drug laboratory, and they get exposed to some drugs which causes them to hallucinate. So when they're in these kind of tunnels and they're sort of starting to see things, so you think, oh, okay, they're not going to know whether the monster's real or if it's going to be a hallucination, and sometimes it's going to be a hallucination, sometimes it's going to be real, and it's a concept that is wasted. And instead, people just kind of see, oh, it's like it's my son, or it's my grandfather, or it's a bunch of strippers and things like that. And I feel the cleverness of that concept is somewhat wasted, just having these kind of these hallucinations of stuff which, if you can clearly would know it's obviously a hallucination. You're not going to have a bunch of strippers in a Taliban cave, for example. Even if you're on drugs, you should be able to, I would say, be able to kind of piece that together and things like that. So that concept is a little wasted, and I felt the second act was just a little bit too slow. As I mentioned, I quite like the kind of the practical effects in regards to the creature, but it looks a little bit goofy, if we're being completely honest. It looks a little bit too colourful, and I don't know. Obviously it is just a man in a suit. It kind of looks like a man in a suit. Again, it's a lower budget. I'm not going to rag on that for too much, because I quite like this quite unique design, although I don't 100% think it kind of quite worked. And then ultimately the story is very, very predictable. It isn't trying to do anything too original here, and the original concepts that it has, it doesn't do much with. That being said, I was impressed with a relatively low budget movie that still actually has a reasonable production value. Certainly with our military characters, I actually thought they were quite well portrayed, and except for one exception, all seemed quite believable kind of characters, and I quite kind of bought into their kind of camaraderie as a kind of a military unit, and you believe that they are, a military unit, but ultimately quite inexperienced. I thought that came across quite well, and I like the attempt here to have somewhat of a different type of alien creature, even though I don't think it fully works. So that to me pushes this as a little bit of an above average kind of B movie, and quite an enjoyable one, albeit it has some kind of drawbacks. So I'm going to give this one a 6 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.